All right, well, we're diving into intervention, and there are three aspects to how we grow within the intervention framework. And those are focus, fruitfulness, and faithfulness. In this episode, we're going to spend our time on focus. And when we say focus within the context of intervention, what are we talking about here?
So focus refers to what we're actually trying to accomplish in the way that we engage. Previously, we talked about domains as the subject areas or the categories of our giving. When we talk about focus in intervention, we're talking about how we actually view the problem or brokenness that we're trying to enter into. And that has a significant effect on how we actually approach engaging it. Now, as will be a theme throughout this intervention series, there is a progression of how givers grow in focus, just like in these other areas that we're going to talk about soon. And as we actually start engaging with the world around us, we will begin to progress through these 5 stages.
Yeah, and I would add that when we talk about intervention, it primarily applies to domains 3 and 4, which are restoration and compassion ministry in domain 3 and the spread of the gospel in domain 4. And as we step into each of these domains, we tend to move through these 5 stages. In the first stage, we focus on the problem. In the second stage, we're focusing on the pattern. Third, we focus on the place. Fourth, we focus on the partnership. And finally, in the 5th stage, we're focusing on people. So let's start by unpacking stage 1, the problem. What does it mean to focus on the problem?
Well, I think this is a natural starting point for pretty much everybody once you step into giving, especially in domain 3 and domain 4. When we focus on the problem, we're confronted with the tangible symptoms and results that are right in front of us. These are concrete issues like hunger, lack of clean water, injustice, human trafficking, addiction, lack of access to the gospel, and the list goes on and on. Often people are particularly drawn to one or two of these kind of problem areas. And in the beginning, we can really see them as very distinct problems. As we think about our giving or intervention in general, we think about it as trying to fix a problem, trying to undo something that is broken in the world. And that significantly shapes how we actually go about entering into that space or that problem.
As we seek to solve a problem that we've chosen, we tend to realize as givers that people experiencing the problem we've chosen actually experience many different problems that are interrelated and inseparable. And isolating just one problem is just part of the equation. And this realization takes us to our next stage, focusing on the pattern. So what are we talking about when we say focusing on the pattern?
The pattern refers to this underlying web or network of factors that contribute to the surface level symptoms that we identify in that stage 1. This often occurs as we start to see repeated examples of failure in the same way over and over and start to dig a little bit deeper to understand why this or that strategy isn't really working. It involves a recognition that the problems we identify in stage 1 often have many layers to them and trying to really address the root causes in the interventions that we use. Throughout these stages of growth in our focus, you'll see a lot of themes from the book When Helping Hurts, which is a fantastic resource on everything that we're talking about in this episode. And one of the key aspects that many people are familiar with that applies really well to this stage 2, focusing on the pattern, is what we call relief, rehab, and development. As we encounter brokenness in the world, especially physical brokenness or poverty, it's important that our interventions match the situation appropriately. Relief refers to providing help or support in a state of active emergency or disaster. This is commonly thought of as trying to stop the bleeding. And at this point, we're not talking about chronic problems. We're talking about supports of an existing community being taken out from under them and trying to slow the ripple effect of damage that is occurring. Common examples when relief is most appropriate would be in the context of a large natural disaster, in the aftermath of a war, or other events like those that cause a sudden increase in suffering across a large group of people. Rehabilitation refers to trying to get that community back to their baseline state. We're not talking about trying to improve the long-term status of a community. We're just trying to get a community back on its feet, back to the baseline before whatever kind of event, disaster, war, etc. The third approach to intervention is development. And this is where we're trying to come beside a community to improve long-term chronic patterns in order to increase flourishing of the whole community. And that's the area that a lot of what we're going to be talking about in this episode is focused on. But as we talk about this stage 2, focusing on the pattern, it's important to know which of these 3 phases you're actually dealing with: relief, rehabilitation, or development, and correctly applying the intervention to the situation.
When we focus on the pattern, it can be exciting as givers to start to identify root causes and see how interventions can really meet communities in their need. But over time, we tend to realize that those same best practices and those same root causes don't necessarily apply in every context. Different geographies, different communities have their own context where an established pattern may not actually apply. And that takes us to our third stage, which is focusing on the place. So let's unpack what it means to focus on the place.
So focusing on the place takes this idea of patterns or the underlying structure that is leading to lack of flourishing and trying to contextualize it to a specific community or specific place. It's trying to fit the lived reality of a given people and their cultural norms, their history, the formal and informal leadership patterns in a community, the spiritual dynamics that shape people's lives. And as we start to incorporate many of these factors, it significantly shapes how we go about intervention and begins to move us to much better fitting, sustainable solutions to increase flourishing. Some of the important concepts that begin to arise at this stage involve a deep reliance on active listening and learning, less focus on coming in and quickly jumping to problem-solving mode, and instead first trying to really understand aspects of a culture or a community that might be very foreign to how we naturally think about life or relationships. It involves a new layer of humility in realizing that how we might naturally address something might not be the best. It's a move away from paternalism in how we intervene and a move towards contextualization. And this leads to a deeper level of discernment in how to best serve and come beside a community in whatever aspects of need they may be experiencing.
Although we've grown a lot in our approach, at this stage we're still looking at communities, trying to identify what they lack. What do we need to bring in from the outside? What information, what processes, what resources need to be added in order to improve the situation? But when we take this approach, it skips over the assets and the resources that exist within the community already. And that's where we move to our fourth stage, which is focusing on the partnership. So what does it actually look like to focus on partnership?
I think stage 3, where we're focusing on a place or a community, is actually a natural lead in, if we really dig in intentionally in that stage, that leads us to this next stage of focusing on partnership. At this point, our posture changes from designing solutions from the outside to seeing what already exists in a community and how to fuel or supercharge what is already working, what assets a community already has. And when we're talking about assets, we're not just talking about money or physical resources, but also skills, relationships, partnerships, community rhythms, local leadership, and momentum within a group. Every community has assets, and those are often ignored or skipped over or marginalized when outside organizations or people come in to try to fix a problem for a community. With this partnership-based approach, we slow down a little bit to try to see what is already working well in a community. Sometimes that involves helping a community to recognize that themselves, creating focus groups where people can point out each other's strengths within a community and say, you are a builder and have skills at using the local raw materials in this region to build. You are a mobilizer and can draw people together really well. You have a gift of hospitality and make people feel warm and connected. Drawing out these things in a community is what's going to make whatever kind of intervention is at play much more sustainable and owned by the community themselves. In this kind of partnership-based approach, there's also a heavy reliance on local leadership and local ownership of an intervention. It's trying to have a community feel a sense of shared responsibility and decision-making over any kind of intervention that might be implemented. It can often be slower than trying to come in and implement something from the outside, but it's much more likely to be sustainable and lasting and accepted and adopted by the community, and fosters much less dependence on outside resources, leadership, support. And that sets up a powerful foundation as we try to create actual lasting change in a community.
Yeah, in stage 4, when we focus on partnership, our thinking starts to shift from giving people a handout to giving them a hand up and recognizing that we are not coming in from the outside to save the day, but instead we might help a community recognize what they already have. So at this stage, we have contextualized interventions that address root problems, that promote dignity and recognize local leadership and ownership. But there's actually another level deeper as we move to our 5th stage, which is focusing on people. So in this context, what does it mean to focus on people?
Yeah, you might think, haven't we been focusing on people the whole time? What's different about this stage? When we say focusing on people, we really mean focusing on the whole person. And people are not defined by the problems that we identify or by their lack of flourishing in one area or another. In the book, When Helping Hurts, Steve Corbett and Brian Fickert identify 4 relationships that every human being has that define who they are as a person. And those are their relationship first with God, then with self, then with others, and with creation. In this stage 5 that we're talking about, focusing on people, we're talking about seeing these 4 relationships as inseparable for each person, that each person in a community is an image bearer of Christ and cannot flourish to the degree that they are lacking in any one of these 4 relationships. We often like to simplify and compartmentalize the aspects of a person or a community that we can engage with, but in reality, a person's spiritual relationship with God, how they view themselves, how they interact with people, and how they see their role as a steward of creation and their commission as a human created by God are all inseparable. When we start to view people in that way, it significantly changes how we go about intervention, what we're actually trying to accomplish in the first place. It can often make it messier at times and potentially more complicated, but it's also where the deepest, most profound change can happen, not just in an individual, but in a community as a whole.
So let's dig in a little bit more into these 4 relationships: a relationship with God, relationship with self, relationship with others, and relationship with creation.
So one of the most helpful places to look at these 4 relationships in their ideal design is in the very beginning of Genesis. we see God created Adam and Eve with all of these relationships intact. In the original design, human beings were created to live within God's loving rule, receiving their identity from Him, their purpose from Him, and their joy from Him. Everything flows from God and our relationship and connection to Him. In the garden, there was continual nearness to God, a trust in His character and goodness, an obedience that flowed from love, and worship expressed through all aspects of life. God designed humans to flourish in relationship with Him. And that level of nearness and security and purpose is not possible outside of that relationship. When that relationship is broken, it looks like distrust in His goodness, false gods or idols that take His place, separation from God resulting in fear, alienation, or spiritual confusion, living as the authority of our own lives, and pursuing meaning, identity, and purpose apart from Him. All of this was not how we're designed to live, and we cannot flourish without this relationship intact. It will begin to pour over into all the other three relationships. When we look at relationship with self, human beings were designed with a clear identity grounded in Christ, with dignity as image bearers, with a sense of purpose and meaning that stems from that identity in Christ, and with emotional wholeness marked by hope, courage, and stability. This is how we were designed to think about ourselves. When this relationship with self is broken, it tends to swing to one of two ends of a spectrum. On one end, it can lead to shame, self-hatred, despair, low expectations, internalized failure, or a belief that we simply can't do anything for ourselves. On the other end of the spectrum, it can lead to pride, inflated ego, self-reliance, superiority, a God complex, and a refusal to accept help from anyone else. This brokenness leads to hopelessness, passivity, anxiety, fear, false identities built on achievement, wealth, or power, misuse or neglect of one's gifts, and to addiction or control or escapism. As we look at our relationships with others, God created us for loving fellowship, mutual service, and community shaped by justice, peace, and shared responsibility. This involves mutual respect, trust and vulnerability, interdependence rather than independence, compassion, hospitality, generosity. When these relationships are broken, we see distrust, suspicion, competition, conflict, exploitation of power, isolation, loneliness, breakdown of the family, friendships, or community. We also see systemic injustice, unjust laws, corrupt systems, and economic structures that take advantage of some while harming others. And these two flavors of brokenness in individual people and brokenness in systems fuel each other. Broken people create broken systems, and broken systems perpetuate broken people. And finally is our relationship with creation. In the garden, human beings were given royal stewardship over creation. Work is not part of sin. Humans were created to cultivate, to protect, to develop the world in ways that reflect God's character. Work was meant to have meaning and contribute to human flourishing. We were meant for creativity, expressed through agriculture, craftsmanship, enterprise, and innovation. And work was meant as worship, not as drudgery or punishment. When this relationship is broken, this again can lead to one of two extremes. On one end is idleness, apathy, disengagement, lack of purpose, unwillingness to work. On the other end is idolatry of work, identity rooted in productivity, overwork, exploitation of others, and endless striving. Instead of cooperating with creation as a steward, we often fight against it as a slave or abuse it as a tyrant. At stage 5, as we focus on people, we seek reconciliation of all 4 of these perfectly designed relationships within each individual and community that we seek to engage. It's seeking to realign people with their intended design.
As I reflect on these four relationships, I can think about my own journey as a giver. How in the beginning I tended to focus on the things that I have that others might need that would improve their lives. But this takes a very narrow view of just one relationship. But when I'm honest, all of us experience brokenness in all four of these relationships. And even as a giver, I can recognize that I have just as much to grow in these areas as anyone that I might give to or serve. And it helps me develop a more holistic view of the restorative work that Jesus is inviting each of us into.
Yeah, it is humbling to come to terms with the fact that we are broken people trying to love broken people. And that, I think, helps to balance out the whole system in a much healthier way. That we begin to approach giving with much more humility, and we realize that there's a mutual transformation. As we seek to come beside others in their place of need, God often meets us in our own place of need and of growth, as ultimately He is restoring each of these four relationships in all of us.
So, to help make some of these concepts more concrete, let's talk about how we might grow through these five stages in a real life example like providing clean water.
Sure, so let's take stage one, focusing on the problem. A team might come in, see a community lacking clean water, see some of the ripple effects of what that is causing among the community, and say, this is a preventable problem. Let's dig a well in near proximity to this community. Once the water is flowing, they'll have access to water, and many of these trickle-down effects will improve. It's focusing on an immediate problem and coming up with a tangible solution to meet that surface level need. Now moving on to stage two, focusing on a pattern. A more experienced team may come in recognizing that coming in and digging a well has a very high failure rate if not done carefully. That wells often require some level of maintenance, care, and repairs at times, and that there needs to be some kind of a process for that. So this team comes in, builds a well, and provides some basic training to some of the community, as well as a manual with some instructions for how to make some simple repairs for various problems that might arise. And the goal is to create a more sustainable solution that will last for a length of time. Now in stage three, focusing on the place, a different team might come in and realize that there are a lot of nuances to how this community operates. They start with a listening approach, trying to understand the local relationships, politics, leadership structures, the daily rhythms, and realizing that the well's placement in proximity to the community and along the natural travel patterns of the community members, as well as the governance for how it is stewarded and managed among the community, is all very important and takes a lot of this context into account as they design not only the structure of the well, but importantly, how it is placed in the community and how it intersects with the community rhythms and patterns. Moving on to stage four, focusing on partnership, a different team may come alongside and begin with the same listening approach, but also identifying assets in the community, even pointing out assets that the community may not realize they have themselves, identifying natural local leaders, identifying local resources, using local labor, and most importantly, focusing on decision-making within the community, allowing the community themselves to take ownership of the process and providing only what is absolutely necessary from the outside. This might involve creating some kind of a focus group of community members that are interested in being a part of the process, even creating some local leadership within that focus group, and transitioning that group as the well is actually built into a local governance structure that can take over long-term ownership of the well itself, involving them in the building process so that they can understand how it works and maintain it over time. In the end, ownership really rests with the community who feels like, in a real sense, they have supported their own community in the process. And then moving on to stage 5, focused on people, a final group may come beside a community and take this same approach, but they may have a local pastor help lead the focus group as they seek to make decisions and design some of the processes. And as the gospel is integrated into this focus group, the idea is reinforced that as God has provided for us, so we provide and care for each other. And over time, this begins to have ripple effects through the community in all 4 of these relationships, with God, with self, with each other, and with creation and their view of stewardship.
Yeah, in that example, you can definitely see how as we grow through these progressions, we develop a much more holistic intervention. So let's take a look at another example like church planting. What would it look like to focus on people in this context?
Well, let's start all the way back at stage 1. When we're taking a problem-based approach to sharing the gospel, the obvious problem in front of us is that people have not heard the gospel. So an approach at this stage might look like a big 1 to 2 week trip where there's mass exposure to the gospel in a region, lots of people hearing about Christ, and then the team leaves. And in this kind of approach, you're looking for how many people can we move to a decision for Christ in this amount of time that we have, and then maybe moving on to the next region. As we move to a pattern approach, there's a recognition that exposure alone rarely leads to a lasting, true faith, that there needs to be some level of continued presence and ongoing engagement in order to continue to share and to deepen and strengthen that faith. And so that approach might change to a missionary moving across the world and choosing to live in a region for an extended period of time, a couple of years or longer, in order to more deeply invest in a community and share consistently over a long period of time. We see this kind of model all the time. As you take that even deeper, we move to stage 3, a place-based approach. And so that recognizes that one region or village is going to be potentially very different than another. And at this stage, there's an acknowledgement of the underlying culture and existing worldview and communication style of the people that you're actually interacting with. If you're dealing with an oral-based culture, which is common in many areas of the world, then you might not be using written scripture. You might be using audio Bibles, which is done in many places now. You might use local stories and metaphors familiar to the community you're engaging with. And you might contextualize how you share the gospel in light of the existing spiritual worldview of the people there. We see this when Paul went to the church in Athens, as he adapted how he was sharing the gospel based on the way that the Athenians viewed their local gods. Now we can take this even deeper to stage 4, a partnership-based approach. And at this level, in the evangelism and church planting world, there's a recognition that there is a much greater acceptance of the gospel when it comes from somebody in the existing community or from an adjacent community with very similar language, culture, and customs background. So with this approach, rather than sending somebody from the West, you might look to empower a pastor or missionary from a neighboring village or community to come in and develop long-term relationships in the community, empowering them to use their own cultural background and familiarity in order to more deeply engage in the community. This kind of approach gives much deeper level of ownership and investment among the people that are tangentially already connected to the community. And we have seen this strategy explode in the last number of decades across the world, with huge fruit coming from empowering local and semi-local missionaries and pastors to reach neighboring communities in all parts of the world. And then finally moving to stage 5, a full people-based approach in church planting is going to look beyond simply getting people to accept Christ or counting baptisms to wanting to see whole life transformation in the community in light of the gospel. So this is going to look like taking somebody from becoming a new believer into deep discipleship in all areas of life, shaping their identity in Christ, shaping how they view family and marriage and parenting, how they view their work and vocation, how they view their obligation to their community and love for others, and how they multiply their own faith spiritually in sharing with others. That kind of discipleship, even in one person, is going to be deeply and powerfully transformative. And you can see how different that is than this stage one problem-based approach, where we're simply just trying to get people to make a decision.
Yeah, it's helpful to think through how, regardless of which domain we're operating in, which problem we start with, there's always a deeper level, a way to understand the holistic, integrated needs of an individual or group of people. And this really reflects the way that Jesus operates through Scripture. We see lots of examples where he is focused on the person and the whole person in front of him. As you talked through some of these examples, I was reminded of the leper that Jesus heals in Mark chapter 1. This individual is experiencing an obvious problem. They had a contagious skin disease that would have both physical and spiritual implications in that community. He would have been separated not only because of the disease, but because he was ritually unclean. And so what you might expect from Jesus in this instance is healing from a distance, which we know that he's capable of. We see other examples of Jesus doing exactly that. But Jesus goes straight to focusing on the person in front of him, and he does something unthinkable. He moves towards him and reaches out and touches him. And he responds to the man's begging by saying, "I am willing, be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him, and it says he was cleansed. He was physically healed in that moment.
Yeah, I love that example. And as you were describing it there, I think one of the things that stands out to me is that when he reached out and touched him, it wasn't his touching him that cleansed him. When he touched him, he restored relationship and human connection to this man. And it was only after he spoke and said, "I will be clean," that the leprosy actually left him. And on a whole nother level, after the actual healing, then he says, "Go show yourself to the priest, offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for proof to them." He says, "This disease has been making you spiritually unclean according to the law for probably years." And he offers him spiritual restoration in the act. And so in this couple seconds of interaction, Jesus deeply reaches multiple dimensions of suffering that this man has experienced. And I think through if I were advising Jesus on this problem, like the disciples often did, I would have taken a totally different approach. I probably would have said, "Hey, you have incredible power. Let's set up a command center in the middle of Jerusalem. You can heal people all over the region from the command center and don't even have to get near them to make yourself medically at risk and spiritually unclean by touching a leper. And then we can have people go around and walk them through the spiritual cleansing rites. And then after that, invite them back into community." Makes perfect logical sense. And that is just not how Jesus does it. He sees the person through the problem. He does not see this man defined by leprosy and a simple problem that needs to be fixed in front of him. He sees the true, deeper suffering that this man has gone through across every dimension, and he steps into it in that moment. That is not an easy way to engage with needs in the world, but that is the way that Jesus invites us to move.
And something interesting to note is apart from Jesus, nobody would have touched this man because it would have made them unclean. His uncleanness would have transferred onto them. And now they have a problem to deal with, so they would have had to put themselves at risk to do exactly what Jesus did. But Jesus is the only one who can transfer his own cleanness to you. And in doing so, he restores the man physically and spiritually. Now, if we were setting out to solve this man's problem, we probably would have classified it as a physical ailment. There's a disease that needs to be healed. But Jesus tends to every level of this man's suffering simultaneously in one act. But this is not an isolated incident. I think this is how Jesus operates all the time. Wherever he goes, he sees the people through the problems they're experiencing. Like when he feeds the 5,000, he is trying to teach them spiritual realities. But the crowd is hungry and is creating a distraction. It's preventing Jesus from being able to teach. And I've even seen examples of this in my own life where I'm trying to listen to a sermon and somebody's creating a distraction. And your first instinct is to remove that distraction so that you can focus on the teaching. And that's exactly what the disciples go to.
Yeah, it's interesting. The disciples are so focused on the discipleship happening in that moment, the teaching, that they say, hey, it's evening. We're out of time. We've done what we can do here. Let's send the people home. But Jesus uses that moment to show them how he engages on so many deeper levels than the problem in front of them. Obviously, he provides food for the people to eat, not only allowing him to continue discipleship, but meeting a real physical need for many people in that moment. He asks what they already have. And this boy comes up with a few loaves and fishes. We think back to this asset-based approach, right? Seeing what is already present, what's already at work in a community, and building from that. That's exactly what Jesus is doing here. And he takes the bread and the fish, and notice that he doesn't distribute it himself. He gives it to the disciples to hand out, and it goes to people who give it to people who give it to people. And that is the manner by which Jesus multiplies the loaves and the fishes, by an entire community of thousands of people sharing and giving to each other. And you think about the many layers of what's happening here, right? The people are already receiving teaching and discipleship from Jesus. Everything that he's doing is deeply accentuating everything that he's just taught them, right? Whatever he has just said now has incredible authority because of what he's doing in front of them. But he's also providing for real physical need in the midst of that. When we think of missing a meal today, it's probably as simple as, I just got to go home and I'll get something to eat later. The reality is, in this crowd, there's probably not an insignificant amount of people who really don't know where their next meal is going to come from. But he also strengthens the inclusion and participation of everybody in that crowd into this miracle. It's not something that he does to them. It's something he does through them and with them. And that's a great example of how we can move from a problem-based focus, like the disciples often had, all the way to a people-based focus.
It's interesting to think through how Jesus does not categorize needs as high priority or low priority. He always finds a way to heal and restore the whole person in front of him. And obviously we are limited. We are not Jesus, but I think we can learn a lot from his example. So whether we look at clean water or church planting or Jesus's example himself, we can learn how to move beyond fixing isolated problems, and we can begin joining God in his deeper work of restoring people to their intended design as flourishing image bearers of Christ, rooted in community, purpose, and identity. And this is the vision that we're growing toward as givers. So that wraps up our overview of the growth pathway of focus and intervention. In our next episode, we're going to dive into our second growth pathway, which is fruitfulness. Stay tuned.